Talk a little bit about, you also look at Duluth, Minnesota, and the you start with this sort of juxtaposition of escaped slaves, I guess, and Native Americans who were being dispossessed. Tell us about that and what that tells us, why that story sort of like illustrates this point more too.
Yeah, well, I opened the whole book, as you know, with that story from Minnesota, and I should say, I didn't want to write. So I've got three states, Mississippi and Oklahoma and Minnesota, that I use as case studies for the book, and I didn't want to just pick on states that were in the Deep South or very conservative states politically today, like Oklahoma. But I wanted to kind of make the point, this was really an American story. I could have written 50 chapters, or one for each state, easily, and told stories like this of indigenous removal, genocide, and enslavement, then kind of settler colonialism. But in Minnesota, I began this story because these worlds actually collide, and you can see this history intertwined in one story. And just briefly, there is an enslaved man named Robert Hickman, who is literate. He's actually a preacher, and he gets word of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he's in Missouri, so it doesn't apply to him in Missouri because it's not a state in rebellion, which is what the Emancipation only restricted itself to. But nonetheless, he takes the opportunity to set out and to free his family and neighbors, and they push out on a raft, hoping to get picked up by a Union steamer, which they do. They tow them up to Fort Snelling outside of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and they disembark there. And what's remarkable is that as they're disembarking, right, kind of reaching their freedom from enslavement, they encounter this group of hundreds and hundreds of Dakota people who've been rounded up the previous year, and are in fact on their way to be exiled, shipped out of Minnesota in the wake of clashes between the Dakota people and the federal government over treaty obligations that the federal government was guilty of not honoring. But sent in, the cavalry, defeated people, and then rounded them up, kept them in a miserable encampment all winter, and then were waiting for the spring thaw to ship them and exile them from the state. And so you have this kind of very poignant example of, on the one hand, formerly enslaved people finding their freedom, and the last vestiges of sovereignty of the Dakota people in Minnesota all at the same time. And I think what's behind that, too, is that just previously there had been in that area the largest mass execution that the federal government has ever presided over. It was 38 Dakota men who were hung on the same day for their part in the uprising there. And also, I think the thing that kind of holds these, this complex history of ours together is that these two documents, the Emancipation Proclamation and the documents that were going to sign the fate of these 38 Dakota men, were on the desk of Abraham Lincoln at the same time, and he signed off on both.
It's fascinating history, and then you also get into I mean, I think folks on this program are familiar with the Oklahoma race massacres, and the Tulsa, and frankly many of them that were happening at this time, but the idea that the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act was largely a function of plantation owners in Georgia wanting more fertile land, and Georgia and Alabama, and then basically sending these people ultimately, to the extent that they lived, to Oklahoma. Is it just the sort of the coincidence of those two things happening, around Oklahoma, or is there a direct or indirect lineage there?
Well, what's remarkable, I didn't really kind of pull all this together until I was deep in the research for the book. But these two things are happening exactly the same time. I was just actually in Tulsa last week, and I intentionally waited to see the movie Killers of the Flower Moon until I was in Tulsa. And I watched it at an old theater that was built in the 1920s in Tulsa while all this was happening. And I think to make the connections, like we learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre, but it didn't get connected for the most part in the public conversations to what was known as the Reign of Terror among the Osage. And that was happening just 60 miles away, just up the road from Tulsa at the same time, right? And so these were absolutely connected events. On the one hand, you've got, and you can see the connective tissue, right? It's about power. It's about seeing wealth by anyone non-white as illegitimate, property ownership as illegitimate. So, at the same time, the Osage, just briefly, were being, who ended up got pushed around several times, ended up on land that white people thought were worthless until it turned out there was oil under that land, and became fabulously wealthy because of that. And then white people turned out to, start this campaign to poison people, to marry into families, to inherit the head rights. It was a really ugly history, but that's happening right down the road from the Tulsa Race Massacre, where, roving bands of white people kind of over a period of a couple of days, murdered over 300 African Americans and burned down the entire section of Greenwood. But it's all, I think, motivated by this, this idea of like, who are the legitimate inheritors of the land, right? As white European people. And just put one little kind of period on this. I actually dug up sermons that were preached in Tulsa the Sunday after the Tulsa Race Massacre. And you could see the Doctrine of Discovery just rearing its head there, where they essentially pretty uniformly blamed the African American people for the violence, and just denied any culpability among white people there in Tulsa.
I want to get to sort of the your, I guess, prescription to the extent that there is one. But before we do, and this may be, somewhat outside of your portfolio, but I'm curious because, one of the things that, and obviously, there's a lot going on right now in Gaza, and that is, sort of the many of today's sort of like events are, sort of, at least in the context of my mind, filtering through that. And I think back to the Balfour Declaration and the idea that, Balfour certainly was looking for a way to get the Jews out of, at least of England, and thought, okay, this might be a good location. That's back in 1917. Obviously, Israel is not founded until 40 some odd years later. But I'm curious about the sort of ability for white supremacy to be sort of like bequeathed. Because the dynamic of, even in the Balfour Declaration, it said you need to respect the rights of the people living there. And certainly at that time, Jews were a significant minority, 1800s through the 1900s, really until the last decade. I mean, they were still a minority in the last decade before the founding of Israel, but like a significant, like single digits minority. But this idea of like, we don't like you, but you're close enough to us that we're going to give you the sort of the magic ticket, which allows you to dispossess the people who are even lot less like us. Mm.
Yeah, it's not my field, so I'm going to be very kind of narrow in my response here. The one thing I would point to, that there is a direct connection, actually, to Jewish people in this kind of doctrine and discovery conversation we've been talking about. It's a little different than what you're talking about. The one thing I would point to is that the other thing that's happening in 1493 and in those areas around there, as these papal edicts are coming about, is that locally in Europe, so we've been talking about how they're getting used across the Atlantic and the Americas, but locally in Europe, these same edicts, right, the term that got used for basically, again, that kind of qualifying question, are they Christian, And if the answer was no, the term that got used was they are to be considered enemies of Christ, like that kind of very bellicose term. And that term got applied to Muslims, to Jews, to not just to sort of indigenous people or African peoples, but to Muslims and Jews as well, that justified like the expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th century as well. So like this is kind of goes all the way back, and it's a lot more complicated in the 20th century. I think with the kind of, this idea of Judeo-Christian kind of amalgamation that we get in the 20th century. But I think even when you hear that term, it's not always as solidarity laden as one might think when you hear that term.
Well, we've seen today in this country the sort of like growing, who gets to be white has evolved over the course of, particularly in the 20th century. And that dynamic as it suits, various people. You got to deal with the Ottoman Empire. I got a twofer here. I can get the Jews out, but also still have a connection that will help us, deal with sort of like our rivals that are growing in the region. But let's talk about, to the extent that there is a path out of this dynamic. Talk about what your ideas are in that respect.
Yeah. Well, you and all of your listeners should be relieved to know that there is no 12-step plan at the end of the book. Everyone should be suspicious if there was one. This is a multi-century problem that we've been dealing with, and these contradictions are. But I still think that. We see it. We're going to see it over and over again in our politics over the next 12 months. We saw it I think this rearing its head in the election of Mike Johnson last week, right? As Speaker of the House. I mean, he is the embodiment. I wrote a piece last week called him the embodiment of Christian nationalism in a tailored suit. That's I think in many ways what he represents. But this deep, whenever we hear our politics dividing along these lines, and that is like, are we, a pluralistic democracy where everyone stands on equal footing before the Constitution and the law, or are we this other vision? Are we a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians? Is that really who America is? Is that the claim that we're hearing being made? And we hear that claim, I think, from Mike Johnson and others in today, right? This is not a 500-year-old problem; it's still with us today. But I think on the hopeful side, I mean, the second part of the title is "And the Path to a Shared American Future." Where I find some hope, I think, is on the ground. And the other thing I did is in each of these communities we've been talking about, Texas, Oklahoma, Minnesota, I kind of hung out with folks on the ground that have been doing the hard work of reckoning with this history, telling the truth, and doing it in a way that is laying a foundation for a better and different future across lines of race and religion, and laying the groundwork for a pluralistic democracy. Just one quick example from Mississippi. It's a very rural county. It's a very poor county, not a lot of resources there. And yet a dozen or so folks got together a few decades ago and said, you know what, we need to tell the truth about what happened here in Tallahatchie County. And we need to issue an apology to the Till family, which had never been done. There were no historical markers in the county that it happened, even though Till's story was known all over the world. On the ground there in Tallahatchie County, there was virtually nothing. And they began to do that work and issued this apology to the Till family and then kept working. There's now markers all over telling this story. And I think this is not in the book because it just happened this summer. It resulted in a new national monument that President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris just announced, the creation of the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument that'll be jointly held in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, and Chicago. That'll be administered by the National Park Service, right? So I think this story now from this group of intrepid group of black and white descendants of enslavers and descendants of the enslaved came together to tell the story and to try to make some healing, build some healing in their local community that's had national consequences. So I think if I find some hope, that's where I'm finding it, seeing this work on the ground.